This episode is brought to you in partnership with Colorado State University's Salazar Center for North American Conservation. On September 28th and 29th, 2021, the Salazar Center will host its third annual International Symposium on Conservation Impact. The virtual event will serve as the first major public convening focused on next steps for the Biden administration's America the Beautiful initiative, with Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack, Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, and White House Council on Environmental Quality Chair Brenda Mallory joining on the second day. The two-day event will also feature researchers, practitioners, and political leaders from Canada, Mexico, and indigenous territories, who, along with their U.S. counterparts, will explore the state of progress towards large landscape conservation goals throughout North America and highlight lessons learned from other national-level efforts, such as Canada's Pathway to Target 1. In this context, the symposium will address critical themes such as transboundary partnerships, indigenous leadership, and climate impacts, with former Vice President Al Gore providing remarks on the urgency of efforts to mitigate climate change. Follow the link in the episode notes to learn more about the symposium, as well as all the important work being done at the Salazar Center. Thank you. Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative individuals who are shaping the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in land conservation, or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time up high in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, adventurers, pretty much anyone who's doing important work, has an interesting story, and loves the American West. My guests today are Lesli Allison and Tuda Libby Cruz. Lesli and Tuda join me today to discuss the critical role of private and working lands in achieving durable conservation outcomes in the United States. Lesli is a founding member and the executive director of the Western Landowners Alliance, a nonprofit organization that advances policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Tuda is a rancher and owner of Ute Creek Cattle Company, a conservation-focused ranching operation in northeastern New Mexico that's been in Tuda's family for more than 200 years. Whether discussing on-the-ground stewardship practices or the intricacies of federal conservation policy, Lesli and Tuda are uniquely qualified to offer informed and thoughtful perspectives on all aspects of private land in the West. While ranchers, farmers, and conservation stakeholders have long understood the critical importance of private land stewardship and conservation, the Biden administration's 30 by 30 conservation goal has brought the topic to the forefront of American politics and mainstream media. 30 by 30 has prompted challenging conversations about what it means to conserve land and has sparked healthy debates about the government's role in private land stewardship. 30 by 30 is a bold initiative, and its implications for private landowners, particularly agricultural producers, are enormously complex. We'll never find sufficient answers in pithy tweets or surface-level news stories. So I was excited to have Lesli and Tuda join me for an hour-long conversation about 30 by 30 and private land's role in large-scale conservation. Lesli, Tuda, and I connected via Zoom and enjoyed a wide-ranging conversation covering everything from Tuda's family history in New Mexico to some of the intricacies of the 30 by 30 initiative. We started out discussing the vital role private lands play in conservation and environmental health here in the United States. Tuda talks about her family's process of restoring her family ranch in New Mexico and the many environmental benefits that they've since experienced. We obviously dig into 30 by 30, discussing its pros and cons and its opportunities and challenges. We talk about the importance of garnering local support for all land-related initiatives, and they each discuss their thoughts on the odds of success for a project as ambitious as 30 by 30. And as usual, they each offer up some excellent book recommendations that I think you'll enjoy. Please check out the episode notes for a full list of topics that we discuss and links to all the information we reference. Hope you enjoy. I was thinking maybe the best way we could start, since there are three of us here on the line, is for each of you to kind of just give a brief introduction about who you are and your organization that you're associated with, so that people who are listening can put the voice with the name. So maybe Lesli, can we start with you first? Can you introduce yourself and talk a bit about WLA?
So my name is Lesli Allison, and I'm the executive director of the Western Landowners Alliance. And we're a West-wide 501c3 organization, landowner-led. We're based here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is where I'm coming from today. And our mission is to advance policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. In a nutshell, what we are is landowners and land managers from all over the West who are really committed to keeping working lands whole and healthy for the benefit of both people and wildlife. And we work in several different areas. We work to help create policies that better support working lands and ecological stewardship on working lands and economic viability. We help landowners and land managers share knowledge across the West so that we can sort of increase our collective knowledge of how to do good management and stewardship. And then we tell the story of working lands. We've got an increasingly urbanized public, many of whom really have never had the opportunity to spend time on a farm or a ranch. And so we try to help tell the story of what stewardship entails and the people behind that stewardship to help bridge that urban-rural divide and hopefully improve public dialogue so that we can reach, better policies and better practices for all of us.
That's great. That's great. You guys do great work. I've been following your work for many, many years. And for whatever it's worth, you got my full endorsement. And Tuda, could you talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. My name is Tuda Libby Cruz. I'm in northeastern New Mexico on a ranch called Ute Creek Cattle Company. And I live in a tiny hamlet, a village called Hueros. The population is 4. And the Spanish translation is the men who drove the ox carts. I'm 7th generation on this land, so my roots go very deep here. And I have a passion for this land. I consider it sacred. And I'm doing everything in my power to make it healthier so that I can pass it on to my children and they can pass it on to theirs. There's a Native American proverb here in New Mexico that says, we do not inherit the land, we borrow it from our children. And so that's what my husband and I have done. I inherited a fifth of my family ranch 21 years ago, actually. And we came back here to live. I'd lived in Wyoming for 37 years. My heart never left the ranch. And when we came home, I had a big job ahead of us because we came to land that was, drought out, and there were 4 large pastures and a herd of wild cows, and there were 4 sources of water, and 10 miles of Ute Creek was severely infested with salt cedar. So our job of conservation work began then. And we're very proud that we've worked hard. We've been very dedicated. We've been collaborative in everything we've done. Couldn't have done this without all the partners that we've worked with. But we've really transformed the land. And it's been a lifetime of work in 2 decades. And I've loved every moment of it. It's the most satisfying work I've ever done.
Well, thank you both for giving this background on what you both do. And, I've got so much admiration for Western lands and working lands. And I think I've got a bit of a unique perspective on this because, as you can tell from this accent, I'm not from the West. I'm from North Carolina. And my whole family's been in North Carolina since they got off the boat from Scotland in the 1600s. And when I moved west in 2005, I was a outdoor enthusiast. I loved nature. I loved being in the mountains. That's why I moved west. But I had a very incorrect thought about what conservation was. When I think about myself moving out west, and I thought that conservation meant getting people off the land, getting livestock off the land, making things like a quote nature preserve. And I very quickly started associating and working with ranchers and farmers throughout the West. And I very quickly realized how wrong I was, that the farmers and ranchers, particularly in the West where they're doing it at scale, really are the basis of conservation. And there's a huge opportunity there to really conserve the land at scale. So I'm very happy to talk to y'all, and I'm still learning every day. And so I'm glad for this opportunity. Lesli, maybe we could start with you. Could you just talk a little bit about private lands and the role that they do and can play in conservation, maybe particularly about the scale here in the West and the opportunity that there is with private land conservation and why we need to be so focused on private land conservation as a way to really move the needle on global conservation?
Sure. So I think that conversation really starts with thinking about where private lands are located on the landscape and why. And so in the different Western states, of course, you have differing percentages of public and private land. In some states like Nevada, the great majority of the land is publicly owned, but the privately owned portions tend to be the richest biodiversity per acre. They tend to be where most of the water is. They are the places that are habitable more on a year-round basis. And the reason for that is really simple. Human beings going back forever settled in the places that were most habitable, that had the fertile soils and had the wildlife and had the water close at hand. And those places eventually, came into private ownership. And when we started trying to preserve wilderness areas, those were typically the places that were left. They were the places that weren't occupied by people early on. And so they were the least habitable. And so if you think about, I just came out of the South San Juan Wilderness for a 3-day backpacking trip. It's absolutely spectacular up there. Some of my favorite places are in wilderness areas. Those are very high peaks that you can't go up there in the middle of January, for example, very easily. You certainly can't live up there at 12,000 feet. So that's not habitable year round. And the wildlife, either hibernate or come down the mountain. And then the same thing with our lower deserts, canyon country. I was just out in Canyonlands for vacation this spring. And, it's beautiful slick rock. I love it. Not the highest level of biodiversity relative to other places. So the biodiversity really rests in the working lands. And if you look at something like sage grouse, the critical habitats for sage grouse are those wet meadows, often located on private lands. And often it's agricultural activities that are also helping support wildlife. So it's irrigation, for example, that's providing some of that wet meadow or providing the water that is now an incredibly important drinking source for wildlife, especially in drought-parched regions of the West. So private lands are just uniquely important in the whole puzzle. And then the other thing I'll say about that is that the private lands are also the cornerstones, not just of the ecosystems, but also of the human communities. And, a good way to think about that is, you look at places around, the iconic Yellowstone National Park, the elk that summer in the park that the tourists love to come and see, which supports that whole region's economy. Those elk come down in the winters and they mostly graze on the private lands at the lower elevations, right? And so private lands are playing a very important role there. But then the private lands also are providing that agricultural economy as well, and all kinds of jobs and guest services and everything else that's helping rural communities survive. So they're really a linchpin for the West. And so the role, both from an ecological standpoint and an economic standpoint, and also from the perspective of human buy-in to conservation, it really is got to center on the working lands and the private landowners.
Yeah, that's very well said. And so I was thinking maybe what we could do is kind of zoom in, Tuda, on your specific ranch and talk about some of the work that you and your family have been doing there. And then we can kind of zoom out to more at scale, because I believe for this podcast is being produced in partnership with the Salazar Center, and the title is Durable Conservation. And so we want to figure out, how do we do this in a durable way that can last forever? And obviously it starts on individual ranches. So Tuda, can you talk about the 20-year process that you've been through building your ranch? Because it's my understanding from watching you on other videos that it was somewhat degraded when you took over, and you've managed over the course of basically 2 decades to bring it back to life. Can you speak to that a little bit?
No, I'd be delighted to. It's my pride and joy. I have to be honest with you. We knew we needed help. This was a big job when we came back to the ranch, and the land, it was degraded, and we knew that it was going to take a lot of technical direction and resources, and we didn't have either of those. So we went to the NRCS folks, and it didn't take long. They welcomed us with open arms, and before long, we had a contract that was going to address the salt cedar invasive plants in the stream bed, 10 miles of Ute Creek, severely infested. And I'm talking, these are trees, 10-inch trunks on them. Each one of these plants can take up 300 gallons of water a day. They're very high water using plants. So naturally, you lose your underground aquifers from that. So we knew we had to begin there. And so we started with fencing off Ute Creek, both sides of the creek. And because it runs sort of diagonally through the ranch, that actually set the foundation for the adaptive grazing system that we built off of those permanent fences. And we've taken the ranch from 4 large pastures to now 23 pastures because the adaptive grazing system is absolutely essential for maximizing forage production. Now, you can't have moving cattle without water everywhere they go. So simultaneously with that, they designed a water system, a gravity flow water system that through pipelines puts water in every pasture. In some pastures, we'll have water on a fence line and it will water 2 sides of the pastures. So it took us approximately 3 years and before we saw results, because it took a while to start, getting rid of the salt cedar. And after we did that, the water returned to the stream bed. It was truly visible and quite remarkable to see the thing take place. I told people it's like having a very long gestation period. And finally, the baby is born and everyone's so happy because this riparian area on Ute Creek here on our place has become a regional model of riparian restoration. We're very proud of that. It's actually the cornerstone of all the conservation work we've done. As important as that is, we use livestock as a tool. That is critically important. And in these smaller pastures that we have, we continue to split pastures smaller and smaller. We observe cattle go in. They know they're on fresh ground. They know what to do. We don't overgraze. We got a little short grass this past year because we were so short of rain, but it may have been the most serious shape the ranch was in, but that's all taken care of now. We got rain and it's back to its beautiful state. We manage this adaptive grazing system through observation, and we time the cattle grazing in each pasture, and we move them. Sometimes we'll move them, 30 times in a season, a growing season. We have to have moisture in the growing season. It's fine to have moisture year round, but you must get it early in the spring and summer months, or the plants are dormant, and you just can't grow grass in the dormant season. So it's very important that livestock are considered an integral part of forage management as well as healthy soil. Because cattle go in, there's a little soil disturbance from their hooves, they fertilize it naturally, they move around and don't overgraze, and we move them on to the next one. I tell people it's kind of like mowing a lawn. You do that, the grass grows back. It's quite something to watch it and to experience it. We've really turned the land around. Healthy soil is the result. What happens on top depends on how healthy the soil is underground. And so we now see, just this past season, we've had probably 14 inches of rain and the ground looks gorgeous. But we didn't have water in the borrow pits. We observe these things. We used to have a little runoff because we have a watershed off of some beautiful black hills. And I would say even in past years, we've had some buildup in the borrow pits. This year, none. The land or the water percolates into the soil. And we're observing that and feeling very, very proud of it.
That's great. And I found some great videos on YouTube of your ranch, and I'll link to those in the episode notes so people can look, because it really is spectacular. And we could spend 2 or 3 hours just talking about all the specifics of your ranch and everything you've done. I mean, everything from the stock tanks and how you put those little balls in there that eliminate evaporation. I mean, it's really, so I'll encourage people to go to the episode notes to see that video. Lesli, when you see somebody like Tuda and her family who have had this great success on their individual ranch in their specific region of the West, how do you think about scaling that? Because ideally you want every ranch in the West to be having this sort of success. But obviously, every landscape is different. Every family that is on that landscape is different. And in general, a lot of people wouldn't be excited to be told what to do by somebody from a different part of the country or another region. And so in your role of trying to corral all this good energy and success stories and figure out a way to really scale it, I mean, how do you even begin to think about figuring out a way to collaborate, share information, and scale things?
So, what we're really talking about is stewardship. How do we steward these lands that we need to depend on for our sustenance in a way that gives back to the lands, right? It's really a two-way relationship with the land when we start talking about stewardship. And that's different from preservation, which is setting land aside from human impacts. And it's even different, I would say, from conservation, which is sort of this wise use idea that we're going to try to limit our impact on the land. This is really about a relationship with the land that is, in essence, regenerative. It's more than sustainable, right? And so we're in a relationship with the land. But I learned when I was a ranch manager, I managed a ranch for 16 years in Southern Colorado. And the person I worked for on the ranch had the best of intentions. We wanted to restore the whole ecosystem, the watershed, bring back wildlife species, learn how to make a living from the land in a way that was sustainable, that we could pass on to future generations and share with neighbors. And that was his goal. And what I learned over 16 years of firsthand experience was that success requires more than good intentions. And it requires what I've come to call the foundations of stewardship. So you have to have the knowledge and the science to know what you want to do and how to do it. And you have to have the resources, right? So you might have to have the money. It's got to be economically feasible. You've got to have the labor. You've got to have those kinds of resources to make it work. And then you have to have the right public policies in place. And that also means having a supportive public in place. So, you might have the first two, but you're running into barriers that sometimes the public isn't even aware of. So you need all three foundations to work. And we're often lacking all of them. So science, as wonderful as science is, it's very limited and it's site specific and it can't be extrapolated across complex landscapes all the time. And we just don't have enough science out there. Knowledge is limited. We're constantly, as science evolves and our experience evolves and the needs of society evolve, the knowledge is it's a moving target. So we're always trying to learn. And that means we have to be practicing adaptive management. And as Tuda said so perfectly, it really comes down to observation and your ability to adapt. And that leads you directly into, do you have the resources to be able to do that? And you have the public policies that will support you doing those sorts of things. And I think one place that the conservation movement has really not been strong on is looking at the economic component of stewardship. People need to be able to make a living stewarding the land and producing the things that human beings need to survive. If land can't support a reasonable livelihood, then only the wealthy are able to own land. Mm-hmm. Right. And if we can't generate our own food and our own fiber and products from the lands here in the United States, it means that we're dependent on another country to do it. And we're just passing on those environmental impacts, but we're undermining our food security, our national security, and our relationship with the land. So we have to learn how to be on the land, but it has to be economically feasible for us. And we have to have the labor that supports that. And that comes down to how healthy and strong the communities are around working lands. So these are all sort of reciprocal relationships that we have to be thinking holistically about. And then finally, the public, it is an increasingly urbanized society and very few people really understand the issues that go on. So it's easy for the public and policymakers to be swayed by rhetoric, by special interest groups, and that makes good public policy very challenging. And that's one of the reasons that we've come forward really is trying to be a voice of stewardship. We're trying to be the voice of people with boots on the ground that every single day are going out there and trying to make this work and trying to leave a healthier world. And that informed voice with good intention has to be in the policy arena and in the public dialogue.
So Tuda, when I was doing some research for this interview, one of the adjectives that kept coming up when people were describing you is that you're very creative and you're willing to try new things. And so, obviously you're living in a place where the population is is 4 and there aren't a lot of people around, but like, where do you get your ideas, or who do you look to when you're trying to come up with creative solutions or solutions that may be brand new to your region? I mean, how do you kind of expand your knowledge while being able to expand your knowledge, but knowing exactly what will work on your ranch in your specific part of the West?
Well, that's a big question. It's an interesting one. I have a problem. I'm so full of ideas, and I love to think of how we could make a better mousetrap or figure out a way to make something work better. And I think in pictures, what really causes problems for me, because I know what it's going to look like before I've even started on it. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting way to see things. I believe in being innovative. We have a little unwritten rule here. If you want to do something and it sounds a little far out, you can go ahead and do it, as long as you say it's an experiment. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, nobody says a word. So we foster experimentation on many levels. And we seek new knowledge. I mean, I have an open mind, a completely open mind of everything that we might be able to do here on the ranch. I borrow ideas from other people. I pay attention to what's happening in other areas, certainly of our state. I just feel it's very important to make use of the information that we have at hand today. We know so much more, and the technology is ever changing. I mentioned healthy soil a few minutes ago. They now have a laser soil tester that you're going to drive around a pasture, and these laser rods go into the soil and will give you a soil analysis in real time. Now, that's pretty incredible, because healthy soil is so critical to everything we're doing. Buy into it. I just think it's such satisfying work. It's so much fun. And watching the results it's indescribable. We have wildlife we've never had here before. We have birds. I have a wild bird sanctuary, 23 acres set aside. It was a birthday gift. Whoever thought that it would become such a remarkable thing, given the fact that birds are imperiled in this day and age. And we must all do everything we can to create healthy areas for them on the ground so that they can make this humongous migratory journey from Mexico clear to Canada across the middle of the United States. So these things are critically important. These are signs that are telling us we can all do a better job, and we must. And I tell you, it's on the landowner's shoulders. And I don't have time to fuss with people or argue or get involved with the political pluralization that goes on in this day and age. I have the capacity to oversee what happens on this 14,000 acres of land in New Mexico. And I focus on that. And it is so rewarding. And we've had so much fun. And I would encourage other people to try it. If you don't try, you have no chance at all of making anything happen. If you try, you have a 50-50 shot. Why not try?
The thing I'm always struck by when I talk with folks like you, and then I do a lot of my work with Palmer Land Conservancy, is with farmers in the lower Arkansas Valley of Colorado. And I'm always struck by the complexity and the creativity of the actual business of what you're doing. And these tech entrepreneurs out in Silicon Valley get all this press about being so innovative and creative, but y'all are running about 15 different businesses within your business. You got logistics, you got HR, you've got all these different moving parts, and it's really amazing to witness. And I admire it so much. Lesli, back to you for a second. One of the big news pieces that I guess are current events related to conservation at scale, or durable conservation at scale, has been this 30 by 30 initiative. And I think probably everybody who listens to this podcast has heard the term 30 by 30, but may not really understand what it means. I know my inbox has just been flooded with all this stuff about 30 by 30, and it can kind of be overwhelming trying to figure out exactly what it means. So can you give kind of an overview of, first of all, what 30 by 30 is, and then what Western Landowners Alliance is thinking about it, and how you guys are kind of helping to move forward with that?
So 30 by 30 comes actually out of this idea that we need to set a certain amount of, we need to conserve a certain amount of land and water in order to be able to secure biodiversity into the future. And we're all dependent on biodiversity and ecological function as a species. We're dependent on that too. So it is in all of our interest to see our ecosystems survive and thrive and to conserve and restore biodiversity to the extent that we can on an increasingly crowded planet with pretty significant human impacts. And so I think, there was an idea put out onto the international stage that, maybe we need to set aside 50% of land and water by 2050. But then people said, well, let's do a mile marker in between and let's do 30% by 2030. So it's trying to conserve 30% of land and water by 2030. And, it's obviously being promoted by a number of environmental groups, but the Biden administration picked up on it. And in their executive order on climate, President Biden included the 30 by 30 goal. And the question, though, that this evokes for people, it's really sparked an international conversation, certainly a national conversation about what does it, in fact, mean to conserve 30% of our land and water. If you went with sort of a stringent standard that the USGS, U.S. Geological Society, come up with, which is called GAP 1, GAP 2, which is essentially permanently legally protected land. So think wilderness, for example, wilderness designations. If that's all that qualifies to meet those goals, then clearly you're either leaving out a big portion of the most important part of the landscape, which is the private lands, or you're contemplating putting permanent legal protections of some sort onto those private lands. And it doesn't really contemplate sort of what we would call ongoing stewardship in that function. So basically, to say this, there's a big debate about what is conservation, how do we define it, what counts, and who gets to decide, right? And that is a very lively conversation right now that 30 by 30 has sparked. And we've worked very closely with the Biden administration ever since we heard that the Biden administration was going to include this in that executive order. We got involved to make sure that whatever came out of that was supportive of working lands, that was centered on the input of people on working lands all over the country. And that's farmers and ranchers and fishermen and loggers and everybody else who's out on the land every day managing our land and natural resources, because they have a central role to play in this. But that discussion about what counts and who decides is still underway. And we asked the administration to not dictate that from the top, because we've had too much top down from Washington think tanks and desk jockeys. We want that conversation to be shaped by the people who are out on the land trying to make all this work. So people have criticized the Biden administration's executive order and report, the Conserving and Restoring America, the Beautiful report, for being light on details. We interpret that as an opening, an opportunity in which they are inviting us to help define what that actually means. And they've assigned the NRCS to work with USGS to think about a more expansive and inclusive definition of conservation. So look at what Tuda's doing on her land. It's tremendous. I've been out to Tuda's place many times. It's full of birds, all kinds of wildlife. Life is thriving out there. That is conservation to anybody that wants to go out there and see it. So does that count? Is that supported in 30 by 30? Or does 30 by 30 take an approach that actually would undermine the kind of work that Tuda is doing? I think that's the central conversation right now.
And so, Tuda, when you hear 30 by 30 and, I would just trying to be an optimist about it. It seems like there's good intentions there, but I would think, not to put words in your mouth, but that just in general, the agricultural community would not be, as Lesli said, too excited about think tanks or federal orders coming in from Washington that need to be followed. I mean, I think this needs to be locally driven, or it seems like it would make more sense to be locally driven. So what are your first thoughts on 30 by 30, either yours or other ranchers that you know and work with? I mean, what's on the ground? What are people saying about it?
Well, my thoughts are not always in sync with some of my neighbors. I try to be positive, and I personally see this as an opportunity for stewards on the land to step up and be leaders and direct this initiative to communities, to ecosystems, because everything is different. There's no one size fits all in any kind of conservation work. You might have to tweak it a little bit here. You might have to do something different someplace else. We don't do cover crops on our, 10,000 acres of rangeland. That doesn't work. But in a wet state, it'd be perfect, But we have to have common sense. We have to have the people on the land involved, playing a role in it, saying this will work here. This is what we can do. How can we help you this? What happened to people working together for the good of the whole? I don't see enough of it personally. I'm delighted to share what we've done to anyone who wants to see it or wants to hear what we have to say. I really believe this is a critical time. The climate crisis is very serious. We have wasted decades arguing and fighting about this. We might wear grown-up clothes, but we're acting like children. And I think this really needs to come to a halt. We have to, my mother always said, let's get down to brass tacks and figure out a way to make this thing work to benefit the future for our children. We owe it to them. We're accountable. We're responsible. It's on us. When you think, let me just take New Mexico. I think there's 40 million acres of privately owned land in the state of New Mexico. If every steward on that 40 million acres of land did a few things to enhance the health of their land, the forage production, increase wildlife, increase bird conservation, whatever it is they do, collectively, think of what a difference it could make. Healthy land sequesters carbon in the soil. It reduces greenhouse gases. It would increase your bottom line. You grow more grass. Your cattle weigh more. You make more money. Why don't we think like that instead of saying, well, he said, she said this, it won't work here. It might work for you. It won't. I'm telling you, it'll work anywhere because you figure out a way to make it work. So get out of your lazy chair, your lazy boy chair, and your lazy girl chair, and roll up your sleeves and get something done. We're wasting time. We don't have time to waste.
I would say that there's some things too that we really have in common that I would love people to focus on. So, we're losing biodiversity primarily because we're losing habitat. And the habitat that we're losing is because private lands are being developed. And most of those private lands are agricultural lands. So they're being developed. And so we're losing the biodiversity. So that's on the conservation side. But we're also losing agriculture. And we're losing agricultural communities and all that goes with that. And now we get calls and emails every single week from around the West, particularly with the COVID migrations and things that are going on, of ranching communities that are simply being overwhelmed by development pressure. And I just got one in this past week from a ranch that's just about to be surrounded by development, by a very intense subdivision. That could make it not tenable for them to continue their agricultural operation. And so it's in all of our interest to conserve these lands. That doesn't mean that the government has to come in and buy them all up and manage them for us. That's not the direction we need to go. We need to make it economically feasible for people to stay on the land and keep these lands intact. Those livelihoods are so essential a part of this. And the truth is, extractive land use, development, intensive agriculture, those things pay. Conservation stewardship, the kind of agricultural operations that are compatible with biodiversity, with quality of life, that doesn't pay as well. You still get the same price per pound of beef if you raise livestock in the way that Tuda is versus somebody that's raising it very unsustainably on a Midwestern farm field where there's no wildlife to be considered, right? And so we have a very unlevel economic playing field. And so a huge piece, the win-win solution here is to find a way to integrate stewardship into both our economy and our culture. And we've got to do that together. We can't do that at war with each other like Tuda's talking about.
I agree with that. And my background, before I got into conservation, real estate, basically my whole career has been in the real estate business. And so that's what I know. And when I think about threats, I've always thought about the fragmenting of these ranches and the development of ranches and absentee landowners, people from, who have the wealth to buy a $20, $30 million ranch, and they show up and They're absentee. They may have very good managers in place, but it starts kind of picking away at a lot of different aspects of community, everything from the ecology to the economy. And then this COVID situation seems to put it on steroids. I mean, everybody is trying to live in these rural places. And I mean, I thought it was, I lived and worked through the first financial crisis when there was a big lead up and everybody's buying these ranches. And this current boom makes that look like nothing. And so from Western Landowners Alliance's standpoint, I mean, what are y'all like, what is a solution to that other than everybody putting conservation easements on their ranches, which won't happen? I mean, how do you approach that problem? I mean, what do you even think about? How do you start to deal with something like that? Economic force just descending on these communities.
Well, I think that in order to conserve the things that we care about, we've got to value them properly, right? And you'll often hear people say things like, well, why should we pay landowners to do the things that they either should be doing or already doing? So they should be providing habitat. They should be, doing this and that. So those are essentially uncompensated ecosystem services that landowners are providing. So we'll say, well, we'll pay you, some amount for a pound of beef, but we're not going to pay you for the other parts of what you're delivering to us. We're going to assume you give those to us for free. There's not very many businesses that would survive that way. And so it's time to start putting a value on the things that we want to conserve if we're going to conserve them. And it's pretty easy to sit in an urban center and point a finger out at a rancher and say, hey, you rancher. But think about it this way. Those of us who live in suburbs and cities or use highways or go out and recreate, all of us have displaced wildlife habitat and species. If you live in a city or town, you've obliterated pretty much most of the biodiversity, and you've paid almost nothing in impact for that. If you look at the actual, taxability of the American taxpayer, we pay pennies towards conservation. It's shocking how little we pay. It's about $1.38, I think, a year per taxpayer for endangered species, for example, right? So we're not paying for our impacts. And then the landowner that's managed to keep that habitat open, the last best piece of habitat, and there's a Chiricahua leopard frog out there, or there's some other species that's imperiled. And in the urban areas, we have the nerve to say, hey, you rancher, you better, remove your livestock, or you better do this or that to take care of that species. It's a moral and financial imperative, and the burden's on you. Well, that's hypocritical. It puts landowners in an absolutely impossible position, because the more downward pressure you put, economically, regulatory, public pressure, public access, all those are downward pressures on the last best places that wildlife are hanging on. And then to turn around and say, we expect you landowners to sacrifice to make amends for our impacts as a society. That is not only unfair, it's never going to work. The scale is too great. So we have to learn how, as a society, to pay for the things that we are impacting and that we need and that we care about. Now, whether you do that through the tax system or whether you do that through some kind of market system, is a matter of ongoing debate. But I can tell you this, you probably don't have enough consumers out there to pay the premium on the pound of beef to get that sort of wildlife-friendly product. And we've seen that. The industrial supply chain just doesn't accommodate that right now. So you're not really seeing it through the markets. You've got a very nascent ecosystem services market system. It's very volatile. So you're really not getting compensation good there. And then, our other option is through the tax system, the federal system, for example, but that can be pretty convoluted. There's a lot of strings attached. There's too much complexity in that system. It's inefficient in a lot of ways. So this is kind of the big challenge that we're facing. How do we compensate people for providing that wildlife habitat, all those clean water, all the values, healthy watersheds that as a society we absolutely have to have? How do we all chip in and do that the right way?
So this could be a question for both of y'all, or whoever wants to answer. But I feel like the public lands, the advocates have done such a great job in figuring out a way to let everybody understand that they have ownership in these public lands, and that if they are taken away, that everybody will suffer. If you're an outdoor enthusiast, hunter, everybody from bird hunters to people in the Audubon Society. I mean, and I feel like, especially during the last presidential administration that a lot of groups that used to fight with each other kind of came together because they realized the threat to public lands. And I think just from a marketing standpoint, almost they figured out a way to really galvanize a lot of energy related to what we have in common. And I feel like private lands is a harder thing to do, but if it's just as important, if not more important. And so what could somebody, like say somebody sitting in downtown Denver that lives in a high-rise apartment, but they have a connection to conservation. They love the landscapes, whether it's Eastern Colorado or going up to the mountains and the mountain valleys. I mean, what can a normal person who's not a landowner, who maybe is completely removed from the land 5-6 days a week, what can they do to help with the efforts, with y'all's efforts?
It's a really great question. And there's so many different ways to think about it and try to answer that question. But I would say that the first thing is become educated and be open-minded. We've gotten into a society that's so polarized that all we do is demonize and vilify each other. Somebody, Nikki Silvestri's wonderful diversity, equity, inclusiveness coach, and she says we're very good at othering people, right? So recognize first off that there's a lot of good human beings out there. A lot of reasons that people buy land is because they care about it and they want to protect it and conserve it, right? So we've got allies all through the private land space in this. So first off, open your mind and try to understand, educate yourself on the issues, and let the advocacy groups, whether that's environmental groups that you may subscribe to or your political leaders, know that you think that there's value in working with working lands and farmers and ranchers, and that you'd like to see public policies that are win-win. So we need a voice of support speaking up with us for this movement about stewardship. I think that's maybe the first place. I would say also take the opportunity, if you can, to get to know people who have land. It doesn't matter, ranchers, farmers, anybody that owns land, and begin having real conversations as human beings, and get past all the rhetoric. Put the noise aside, put the Facebook posts aside, recognize we're basically all being brainwashed by that nonsense, and that most people actually have good intentions. So let's find each other and find each other's good intentions. I would say it starts there. There's plenty of organizations that people can get involved with, including Western Landowners Alliance, and support our work and be part of that voice. For an urban person to be involved, I think self-education, really take the time to understand where your food comes from, for one thing, and who it is that is producing that food, and even the fabrics that you're wearing, and think about the impacts. And you can use your consumer dollar to try to support, sustainably produced food. And that sends a really important market signal. So those are just a couple of beginning ways, I think, that we can start working together. And then there are community-based groups in a lot of places, more and more of them every day. We call it place-based collaborative conservation, where diverse stakeholders are coming together to find solutions on the landscapes. And if you've got one of those in your community, see if you can get involved in that. And you'll begin to get a great education, and you'll build all kinds of wonderful relationships across that. And then something that we've been thinking about and we'd like to see more is a concept of community-supported ecosystems. All right. And that's beginning. You have to start with having an awareness about what's the watershed around me? Who's keeping it open? Who's managing it? What are those costs? How is my community, how's my own tax dollar or my consumer dollar either supporting or undermining that? And begin to get involved with efforts. And there's a great example in Chaffee County, Colorado, where the community realized that these farms were really under high pressure for development, very popular area, and that they're having trouble making ends meet. That makes them vulnerable to development. And so the community self-imposed a small tax, and they essentially pay the farmers to keep that land open, keep it in production, and keep that, rural quality to the community and that local food security. And that was an agreement arrived at by conversations between community members and those farmers and ranchers. So it's a neat kind of model that we could see happening elsewhere.
Yeah, Chaffee County, they have done some great work there. I mean, both conservation on the ground with agricultural producers to really coming up with a collective vision for their recreational economy. I know a few of those county commissioners, and Man, I've been so impressed. We're at Palmer Land Conservancy. We really admire what they've done and try to model some of our work off of that. So I'll put links to that in the episode notes so people can see that, because I think it's very very inspiring and actionable. One thing I'll just add to that: when I started working at Palmer, I got invited to go to something called Advocacy Days with the Land Trust Alliance in Washington, D.C. And people on this podcast think I'm an optimist, but I'm actually a closet pessimist. And I thought it was just going to be show up and these elected officials kind of nod and we say what we want, and they're not listening and we leave. But what I found about conservation is that whether you go into the farthest leaning left person or the farthest leaning right person's office, they're all happy to see you, because conservation it truly is a bipartisan issue. And I was blown away by not only how they listened, but the questions they asked, and then the results after the fact. They actually made things happen because of our conversations. And so, 3 years ago, if somebody had said, talk to your elected officials, I would have said, I don't know about that. But now I'm 100% bought into it because I did it and it made a difference. And so I can't recommend that enough. Speaking of optimism and pessimism, when I see COVID-19 and what that has kind of done to our country, and then I think about how that applies to conservation, the optimist in me says that it's made people very aware of the need for open space. People very quickly in about March or April 2020 understood how important it was to know where their food came from, and they saw what happens when that supply chain breaks down. And so I thought it was a great wake-up call for people to understand the importance of the work that we're all doing. Then the other side, kind of the pessimistic side of me, sees, well, all the fallout and the arguing and the confusion. And it makes me think, well, if we can't figure something out for an acute crisis, how are we going to do it for climate change, which is coming our way, but it's not here. It's not acute at this point, although it kind of has been this summer. What do y'all think? I mean, I hope that you're both optimists and you'll make me feel good. But I mean, what do you think of this, the success, the odds of success for whether it's 30 by 30 or figuring out a way to pursue conservation initiatives on private land at scale that's going to make a difference?
Well, I'll comment that it really falls on the shoulders of land stewards to decide whether or not they're going to participate, and they all get to choose. So this is not a mandate. This is voluntarily led. This is for the good of the whole. I don't know which way it's going to go. I'm an optimist, so I believe we will see an increased response. And I have to counter what Lesli just said. As a landowner, and during a drought period, we survived the worst drought in the history of New Mexico from 2008 to 2012. And we had to take our cattle off the ranch because we were out of grass, but we still had wildlife, and, we were feeding them and we were, providing water for them. That's never acknowledged. As Lesli mentioned, the ecosystem services that land stewards provide, we're not compensated for any of that. And sometimes it's really difficult to have to choose between your livelihood and feeding 70 head of elk. So, we do it because it's what we do. But I'd like to be acknowledged for it at least. And I think some sort of compensation for it would be in order, although it's never been done before. We have to be early adopters. We have to be innovators. We have to do things we've never done before. We've got to try it and see if we can make it work. We won't know unless we do.
And I would say that that landowners have, a huge responsibility and stake in all of this. And so do our political leaders, and so do, conservation organizations. We talk about enduring conservation, and we'll never get there on a war footing. There's nothing about war that's enduring. It's win-lose. We'll continue to see the political pendulum swing. If we can't embed conservation both in our culture and in our economy, we won't get there. And it is going to take both sides coming together and working together and understanding each other better. And unfortunately, some part of the conservation movement has sort of seen itself in a war footing, and agriculture has seen itself in a war footing with the environment. And that is unnecessary and destructive. And if it continues that way, if those loud voices on the extremes of that continue to be dominant in the space, then we all will lose. It's almost certain. But there is a very large voice in the middle that has been quiet for too long, of people who want to see good things happen, who are ready to throw their shoulder in, but they need the support and the resources. That voice needs to be raised up and listened to. And if we do that in time, I think this thing can tip in the right direction. You know, Aldo Leopold said the oldest task in human history is to learn how to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. That is humanity's task right now, today, on a global scale. And we have to have working lands in the middle. We have to have conservationists in the middle. We need we need wilderness areas, but we also need this other thing. So it's a yes and it's how can we come together? If we can do that, I'm optimistic. And I believe people want to do that. I believe most people want to. Unfortunately, right now, the extremes are really getting they're the squeaky wheels that are driving this, and we need to change that.
I agree. I completely agree. Yeah, I always learn so much from talking with folks like y'all, and then I want to always continue the learning afterwards. So I always like to ask people about some books that they've read that have helped kind of influence their worldview. And it doesn't necessarily the books don't necessarily have to be about agriculture or the West. But Tuda, maybe we could start with you. Are there any books that you recommend that I should read so I can be as smart as you one day?
One of my favorite authors is Scott Momaday, and I like reading about pioneer women. I love grit in women, and I can't imagine how the West was ever settled because their lives were so difficult, and I find that inspirational, and so I enjoy that. And I go back to Aldo Leopold. The land ethic. I've referred to that many times in the last 30 years. And it really says it all. We are one with the land. We're all connected to it. We all have to do our part. I feel very strongly about that.
And I'm with you on the toughness of both the women and just the folks who came out. As my family was sitting there about, close to the beach in North Carolina for 400 years. Y'all were coming out this way, and I just can't. The toughness factor just blows my mind constantly. And the more I read and the more I learn, the more appreciation I have for it. Lesli, do you have any good books?
Boy, there's so many good books. I just recently finished a book called Range, and it's about generalists and the advantages of being a generalist versus a specialist. And I think that's great. And to that point, I think reading about things other than just land and natural resources, things that inform us about human nature, how we operate together, where the human heart is really powerful in this space. And but there are some things that I've the Grapes of Wrath, the Worst Hard Times about the Dust Bowl days is a great lesson. So is The Big Burn. What are the things that have happened in the past that shape our thinking, that tell us something about land use? Young Men and Fire is another one that has been very informative. And then Dan Daggett's Gardeners of Eden is a really interesting book that affected me when it came out. It definitely helped shift some of my thinking about the human relationship with the land. And I would say I could go into that longer, but simply to say there are a couple of worldviews out there that need to be understood. And one of them is that humans are bad for nature and should be separated from nature, and nature should be protected from us. And the other is that human beings have a role in nature. And this Gardeners of Eden sort of speaks to that, I think, in important ways. So those are some of the ones. I've also lately just been thinking about two books that I really enjoyed: Mountains Beyond Mountains, about Haiti and partners in health, and just because of what's happening in Haiti, and also The Kite Runner. As we've withdrawn from Afghanistan, that book has been heavy on my mind. And yeah, I think both books reveal a lot about human beings and the human condition.
Those are great. Yeah, I'm generally a huge nonfiction person, and I'd say 95% of what I read, but during COVID, for some reason, during these crazy times, I've started going more and more towards fiction. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I'm learning more from novels than I have from a lot of the history books I've learned, because I feel like there are these lessons you can get that you can't get in any other way. One other thing, I'd love for you to talk a bit about the Western Landowners Alliance website and all your different various media projects, because I have leaned hard on y'all's website in the past. I've learned so much from it. I mean, you've got everything from films to podcasts to really substantive articles that I've learned a lot from. And so could you kind of run through what you guys have going on from a media perspective at WLA?
Yeah. So again, raising this voice of stewardship on behalf of stewardship and from stewardship is a really important part of what we do. So our website is www.westernlandowners.org. And you can look at the different tabs on there. We also have another website, actually, and it's part of our magazine, it's associated with our magazine, and that's onland.westernlandowners.org. And both of those really have a lot of material. We produce a number of publications to help landowners in stewardship and finding opportunities to finance conservation work and so forth. We have a series of films we call Stewardship with Vision that we've done in collaboration with Montana State University Graduate School of Film and Photography. We've got some additional films on there now with new partners that show exemplary land stewardship, what's possible. I think they're very hope-inspiring videos. We have a podcast going on right now. The first season is focusing on women in ranching and their stewardship ethics and experiences. We do a lot of outreach to the media, mainstream media, and so we can get that voice of stewardship and try to improve public dialogue, get some of the misconceptions, misunderstanding out, and get some real facts and insights in there. Yeah, so there's a lot on that website. We have a Working Wild Challenge program, which is trying to reduce conflicts between wildlife like grizzly bears and wolves and livestock. Tons of material on the site about that. Our women in ranching programs on the site. So those are just some pieces, and then you can see a lot of our policy materials as well in there. So thank you for asking. We encourage people to go and explore. There's a lot there.
There is. I mean, it is really great. And I think you hit it from all angles. Those films you guys make are wonderful. And that's been one of my complaints, I think, in general, is the private lands community hasn't done as good a job telling stories. And y'all are leading the way. Yeah, I feel like it is invaluable what you're doing on that website. Not like I go to it. If you could track how often I'm on your website, it'd be kind of weird probably. But I really, really appreciate both of y'all. First of all, everything you're doing. I mean, your lives have been committed to this work. And I just, the world is better because of what y'all are doing. And I really appreciate it. And then I just appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to talk with me and teach me a few things. But thank you so much for everything you're doing.
Thank you. And thanks so much for the opportunity to be on the show. We really appreciate your show as well. And anytime I can share a space with Tuda, I'm happy to do that.
I feel the same way about Lesli, and thank you, Ed. So enjoyed it.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.